Welcome back, everybody, to another, I guess, aromatized tasting. We're calling these now. We'll see how this goes. We'll see where it goes from here. We're talking about fruit stuff this week. So Pat and Brett from the Whiskey Hotline back again, along with our friends Jake Parrott and Dan Farber. Colby is joining us as well. Colby works for BC Merchants, the local distributor for a lot of these fine products here, and has a lot of experience with all of these products. So another voice in the room to talk at you about the value of wild blueberries tonight. So Jake, I guess, where do you want to start tonight? Because we got quite a orchard to choose from here.
We've got tonight's a great night. Last week was the hard graft. We spent a lot of time last week talking about a lot of things that people don't munch on a regular basis, things like pine fruits and gentian and rhubarb root and stuff. And we talked about how you might play with those and mixing in cocktails. And we put a lot of pictures of cartoon tongues on display. If any of that intrigues you and you haven't seen last week's presentation, by all means, check it out on the video archive at Benny's Facebook page. It was a rip-roaring good time. This week, we're not going to talk so much about this kind of stuff. We're going to talk about fruit. Fruit is, there's so many different ways that you can get something interesting and at least somewhat boozy from fruit. Fruit has sugar, which can be fermented and can be distilled. Fruit has juice, which can be pressed, and fruit has volatile matter and tannin and acid and all these things that can come from pressing or maceration or whatnot. When you make something with fruit, you have to consider aroma, flavor, acidity, and in some cases bitterness, especially if you're macerating, and figure out what the right way to express the fruit is, and then figure out the right way, the product that you want. In some cases, you want a very pure expression of the fruit. In other cases, you want an expression of something larger where the fruit is an important part. Here in America, though, one of the things that runs through everything we talk about in terms of cocktail modifiers, but I think especially important for fruit because it's an important test, and a lot of fruit things don't pass, is whatever you come up with at the end, you've got to be able to dilute it and still it show through. We make cocktails from these things. That's the vast majority of the usage of most things that are liqueurs or cocktail or wines with these sorts of fruits and herbs are used for cocktails. And those cocktails have ice and water in them, and that dilution, what you get when you dilute, is such an important part of how you should pick fruit things to play with. When you talk about fruit, there's three ways you can get flavor out of fruit. You can distill it. You can ferment it and distill it, or in some cases, soak it in alcohol and distill it. Distillation is a selection process for aromas and flavors. It will take out aromas and flavors that boil at similar temperatures to the overall alcoholic schmutz that you're distilling. Some of those flavors are going to be recognizable as similar to the fresh fruit, and some of them won't. Most fruits can be macerated in alcohol at varying levels of strength. Macerating is a great way to extract the tactile characteristics of a fruit, the textural characteristics of the fruit. And it's, as we talked about last week, sometimes you do get bitterness from fruits, and that may be a part of how you think about how to mix with them. But maceration, there are a lot of variables that we won't get into in maceration because some things work better at very high proof. Some other things work better at about 100 proof. A few things I imagine actually extract best at very low proof, although that's more herbs than fruit. You can also juice some fruits, especially we're going to talk a lot about stone fruit tonight. And so fruit juice is a really important part of that use. And that's, now you're trying to really evoke what you get from hand when you just eat the fruit from hand. Most fruits, that's not enough to really make a flavorful, dilutable alcoholic product, whether that's a liqueur or an aromatized wine or whatnot. But that sensation of freshness and that feeling that you're actually eating the fruit is still something that's evocative for all of us. Bottom left, that's Bernd Perkart, the fellow who distills our fruit brandies and makes most of our fruit liqueurs. So Dan, were you interjecting?
Yeah, I was interjecting. I always say, brown spirits, brandy is all about time. All of fruit distillation, maceration is all about time. And really, the brown spirit side of things is about time integrated over really almost like a century in barrel. But these fresh fruit elements are really all about capturing the essence of the summer harvest in the bottle. Their name reflects that, but really the style of the beverage itself is really reflective of that. In each case, we're really trying to sort of capture the crisp essence of life of the harvest season. So that's always the way I think about kind of generally all these things personally.
Yeah, and then within that you can evaluate them for suitability based on whatever you're looking to do. But for me, it so often comes back to, can you get it concentrated enough in terms of expression, not necessarily in terms of fruit flavor, but in terms of expression in order to be able to use it in a lot of different ways. So, all right, so let's dive right in. Our first fruit for the day is Vaccinatilis, which you might call a wild blueberry. It's sometimes referred to as a bilberry, not to be confused with the original drummer of REM. There you see, you're going to see a lot of sort of purple things on vines today. It's on branches today. I mean, berries and plum type things all sort of look the same, but they're still beautiful. And wild blueberries, they're very different from the sort of blueberries you get here. The flesh is dark, the juice is deep red. There's tons of tannin and anthocyanins in the skins. And so just the juice, even just a really firm, hard pressed juice, is going to have a ton of texture, a ton of structure, as the wine folks would call it, and then the great acidity that's always been associated with wild blueberries. And a product that we work with that captures all of that is a wine-based Amaro called Pasubio. This is another guy from our friends at Cappelletti, who you also know from their Red Bitter Aperitivo, Sfumato, Rhubarb Root, Alta Verde, Wormwood, and then Elisa Novasalis, which is Brett's favorite. But here, the blueberries are integrated into what can only be described as a regional identity product. Pasubio, you see the mountain on the label, is a mountain near Cappelletti's facility in the north of Italy, near Trento. And all the botanicals in this Amaro grow on the mountain. The thing you pick up the most are these wild blueberries, but there's also this pine here. This pine here, which, as you can see, is shorter than Luigi, the producer. This pine is called Mugo, and it's a typical alpine, it's typical bitter used in the region. You snip off the tip of the young branches in the springtime, so you get a little bit of the flower or bud, you get a little bit of the wood and a little bit of the needle. So it's a pretty complex expression of pine. It's not just needles and it's not just fruit. That's the main other flavor, and we would say is the primary bitter here, middle front of the tongue, I think, like a lot of other pine things. There's a bit of rhubarb root here as well for a bit of smoke. The base is not from the north of Italy. It's from Sicily. It's Marsala. Marsala is a great support for these botanicals, especially for the blueberries, because it brings its own sort of sense of richness to the party and but it doesn't get in the way of the acidity of the blueberries. And so what you end up with is a very high acid Amaro, as Amari go. One that is wine-based. I wouldn't keep it in the fridge if you're going to drink it within about 2 or 3 months. The blueberries are hard pressed, so they throw a fair amount of sediment if you get them cold for too long. But the Marsala that they use is oxidized, so there's you don't have to worry about freshness of the wine. Pretty easy one to drink. Another start Amaro, kind of like Cardamaro is. Great with tonic. I love it with lemonade. No surprise, blueberries and lemonade. And one of the few things I find works equally well with gin and whiskey. In particular, wheated bourbons I find work extremely well with Pasubio.
This is a rather unique sort of expression, right? I mean, Myrtle is very Mediterranean, southern Italy, right? And Corsica, Sardinia.
You're thinking of Myrto.
I'm thinking of Myrto, which is different.
That's a different berry.
Different berry, different thing, but sort of in the same sort of vein, right?
No, Myrto's a laurel. Myrtle berries are hard. They look like blueberry, like little tiny blueberries, but they're hard in texture. They're pale on the inside, and their primary characteristic is bitterness. Mirtillo here they look like blueberries, but they are in very, very intense in flavor, color, and acidity.
And this is wine-based, so of course we're going to chill after opening, right? And
because the base is oxidized, I don't think you have to be quite so
really
insane about it. Yeah.
How long do you think it would last?
Open about 3 months.
Interesting.
Yeah, the chilling, like I said a moment ago, the chilling will sometimes throw a sediment, and some people don't like that. So, but
which shows it's not chill filtered.
No, oh gosh, no.
Okay.
I don't think these guys. I mean, these guys have filters around, but they really only just use them for aperitivo. Now we're going to talk about damson plums twice tonight. I'm going to talk about them now, and Dan's going to talk about them later. So Avril is our one American product, and it's a damson gin. And if that sounds like it might be, looks and sounds like it might be a cousin to sloe gin, that's because it is. Prunus incititia, sometimes called Prunus damascena. Damsons originated in Persia and came eventually to what we now know as the UK and the United States. They mostly grow in upstate New York and in Michigan, and they are endangered. There's no two ways about it. They are not great from hand unless they're very, very ripe. They are usually used for jam and pie and things like that. And they don't, you can't pick them early and hit them with ethylene gas and let them ripen. So they have absolutely no relevance to the modern supermarket world. But what they have is beautiful, deep flavor that just needs a little bit of sugar to bring it out. Another case where juicing is used for acidity. You don't want to overpress it or else you'll get too much thickness and richness from the skin extractives here. The skin extractives here aren't quite as tannic, but are more sort of opulent. And this is made in New York State from New York State damsons from one orchard, so true farm to table. The gin base is pretty sweet spice forward, but good amount of juniper as well. And so you end up with something that is intense enough and taut enough that you can use it as a base for a cocktail, for a fizz or something with ginger ale or a lemon soda. There's a really cool Negroni riff on our website with Avril as well. Which maybe I will show here in a second. And then it's really killer in hot drinks. I drink it in rooibos. I like my antioxidants with my antioxidants, but it works well in all kinds of tea. And I think simple hot drinks are going to be another way we get through the next few months. So now there is a tradition of distilling damson plums in Eastern Europe, which we'll talk about in a little while. But Dan's going to talk about that because he knows a lot more about it than I do. This is also a new label for Avril, so we're very excited about that. Some friends helped us out with that. So, staying on the plum train, Prunus spinosa, or the sloe berry, is it's lumped in with the plums, but it's really thought of, talked about colloquially all over the world as a berry, except perhaps in France where the word is prunelle. My screen has gone blank like it often does. All right, there we go. Here, though, the skins are thinner and not quite as packed full of bitterness or tannin or astringency. And so the method that Heyman's uses is a maceration method, which is typical for sloe gin. So what they do is they start with Heyman's London Dry Gin at 50% alcohol, so a little bit higher than it comes to the bottle in the US. And they take whole wild sloe berries from England. They don't prick them. They don't crush them. They don't crush up the seeds. They put them into the booze whole. And the impact is, think about if you're making a whole berry cranberry sauce and maybe you've put some orange juice or a little bit of water in it to get it started. Over the first few days, the skins will just gently pop open. And what you end up with is then you get this really gentle extraction. The acidity and the fruit flavors from the pulp, the tannins and color from the skin, and a sort of wedding cake or almond note from the seed, which is in another use for sloe berries in France. The Liqueurs de Prunelle is there they only use the seed, and so you get this crazy almond note, marzipan note. But here it's just a little seasoning. But the important thing to Hammonds is that these are gin people. These are people who have been making gin since 1863. They want you to taste the gin in the slow gin, and that's really the key point. And having that deep core of oily, rich juniper is a really important part of the dilutability of this slow gin. There's no other added flavors or colors. Some slow gin producers will add vanilla. The maceration is short, just over about 3 months. Some producers will macerate much, much longer, but that creates a much harder extraction, more tannin, more astringency, which means you have to add more sugar. The more sugar you add, the less you're going to taste the gin. So here you get something that really dances across the tongue, but has that core of botanicals that you expect from a slow gin.
Well, and so people that aren't familiar with it, especially the process, which Dan can certainly talk about a lot, the process of pressing, the reason why you wouldn't break those open is if you pressed, right, I'm assuming that what is going to come from the seeds and what is going to come from the skin is going to far overwhelm what's coming from the pulp.
Yeah.
When you're going to break that out, you would have no balance whatsoever if you did it in any other way.
Right.
And I guess what you're saying is if you go longer, then that would eventually catch up anyway.
Yeah.
If you had a longer
that's
maceration.
exactly right. And people, they want deep color. They want to promote this idea that they've slaved long and hard on it and get a higher price. But when you get to that dilutability, that mixability, a slow gin's got to taste like gin as well. And that's really where this guy comes in so strong. I like it just in sparkling wine. And it can be an off-dry sparkling wine, no problem, but it's also a great way to use a lovely champagne. The slow gin fizz, when I make a slow gin fizz with this, I'll add a little bit of Hammonds London Dry, but you can certainly make it without any added gin. And it takes to the egg white very, very well in a slow gin fizz. The egg white will react with the skin extractives to help produce more foam, as well as with the sugar. And this is another
curiosity. Just out of curiosity too, Colby, and you guys can comment, because I've always associated a slow gin fizz as a drink that would be more contemporary to when I was younger, which was a bit before you guys were younger, closer to when Farber was younger. So what has been the lifeline of the slow gin fizz?
I think it's remained a perennial favorite on cocktail lists at most places around the city. I think the process has kind of been bringing people back to a more real macerated thing, other than the kind of fabricated slow flavored liqueur.
Yeah, we have liqueurs that are labeled slow gin here, and they're as much gin as I am, a skinny guy. It's just a bottle of sugar and food coloring, and that's it, right?
Yeah, and that I think has been the harder thing to do, is converting from that to a real gin product. And once people are on board with it, then but that cocktail is sort of a constant, unlike a gin Ricky or something like that.
There we go. The House Alpen's cocktail directory.
So straight from our website, this is a pretty classic slow gin fizz spec. Don't worry, the egg white will not get you. Dry shake here refers to shaking the contents without ice before you add ice. That helps to build an emulsion. There's some schools of thought that say you should shake with the ice and then strain and then shake without the ice. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I'm an expert on the subject. So do it comes naturally to you. But yes, another great use of our House Alpen's recipe directory. Another drink I wanted to show you, an Avril drink, which I love, called the Count of Mount Kisco, because it is a Negroni riff, and Mount Kisco was the only thing that sounded like Monte Cristo in that in New York State. Where is it here? I guess I could have used. Where are you? There we go. Count them out, Kisco. So this is an equal parts drink. 3 things now that we've talked about: Avril, damson gin, Dolan dry to keep it from getting too sweet, and then Solaires is the bitter to really keep the focus, not try to get so much citrus into the drink as you would with a red bitter. Although it is quite tasty with a red bitter too.
Sounds pretty excellent.
Yeah, it's a pretty good drink. So, all right, let's get back at it. So we may have more on gin on a later week. Have some fun with that. All right, now we're going to get really into the core of the thing. The last 6 products we're going to talk about all are based around the distillation of fruit, and there's a lot of misconceptions about distillation of fruit because there's not very much written about it in English. So we're very lucky to have Dan here tonight who actually knows something about it. The other thing is in different countries, things that can be labeled as a fruit distillate are different, especially around how you create what goes into the still. In France, not for the appellation of Alsace, but in France, you can macerate a fruit in alcohol and then distill it and still label it as an eau de vie.
Eau de vie d'Alsace can also be macerated and redistilled.
Oh, it can be. Yeah, you can't chaptalize it for eau de vie d'Alsace, right?
But, exactly. But there's strict limits on the ratio of fruit by weight to alcohol by volume.
Right. But maceration and redistillation is at its core a very different thing than fermenting and distilling. Chaptalization, adding the sugar to the fruit to boost the yield, is something that is done all over the world of fruit distilling. But I find that spirits that are chaptalized often have a bit of thinness or petrol character on the finish. And that's why you sort of think of that the sort of old man image of the bottle of fruit brandy in the freezer because you're trying to tame the finish.
I always refer to that as unsupported alcohol. Like when you're distilling fruit that's actually just fermented from fruit, the alcohol produced is coming solely in balance with the fruit aroma. If you actually chaptalize, you have this extra alcohol, which is actually a huge dilution factor. It's one of the reasons as well that we don't take fruits up to very, very high sugar levels, because that too will provide the same sort of alcohol boost. Doesn't help.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Overripe fruit usually doesn't make very good brandy. Does overripe fruit get you into a methanol problem like it does in agave?
Methanol is cellulosic fermentation. So you do have those types of problems with these products, but only when the fermentation is done with whole fruit instead of being pressed.
Well, right, and in agave, the issue is as much as anything is the amount of skin that's allowed. The pectin in the skin is what really causes the methanol in agave, right?
That's true. I was thinking of something else. Sorry. I was thinking of volatile acidity. Now, we talked about in France the designation eau de vie, which is a little bit nebulous depending on where you are. In the German-speaking countries, things are a little bit tighter. And today, with what we're tasting and talking about, the specific products we're going to talk about, these are all brand or based on brand. Brand is a very strict designation in Austrian law for spirits distilled without chaptalization or added alcohol. So these are fermented and distilled solely from the fruit. So we feel, and Bernd Burkhardt feels, like that's the best expression of the fruit you can get out of a still.
That's true, but we should be a little careful. I'll jump ahead of you in the sense that like some fruits do very, very well with that kind of treatment. The ones we've talked about so far are in that category. Other fruits like raspberry or strawberry are so deficient in sugar that you actually can't typically make a good brand that's less than $300 or $400 or $375.
Right. Yeah, you can. You just can't do it for a price.
Exactly.
Now the question there, and I think this is a good place to talk about this before we talk about the lower grades. The one thing you can, of course, do in the fermentation of a fruit distillate is add water, right? Because you have to be able to pump the thing. Can you, for raspberries and strawberries, between loosening them up with a bit of water and using a vacuum still, can you get to a brand?
Yes, I won't, just the distillery will be unnamed, but I have a strawberry brand, which I paid $300 for $375 for a fraise, eau de vie de fraise, so you know where it came from.
Yeah.
But that was just because it's a friend of mine's distillery. He only does it once every decade when the strawberries are that good.
Does he
But
use a vacuum still?
It's a No, it's not a vacuum still. It's actually probably
well, that makes it
very
even
close
harder.
Very close to one of the ones in the picture. But the thing is that the maceration and then redistillation, which you've talked about in previous discussions, that pathway is actually better, is more commonly better for certain fruits. And so the classic ones would be like strawberry and raspberry, especially, sometimes kirsch, but not always. Sometimes cherry, but not always.
Yeah.
But certainly raspberries, like framboise, is most commonly macerated, then redistilled. But in certain regions, like if it's labeled, and I don't mean to sort of jump, but I think it places it in context. If it's labeled in France, eau de vie d'Alsace, that's a specific AOC, and there the rules of how much alcohol you're allowed to add per kilogram of fruit is very strict. If it just says eau de vie, then the rules are less strict, and the producer could, I mean, in theory, right, you could put one raspberry in a 50-gallon container of alcohol, redistill it, and call it something, or the reverse, right? So just the maceration redistillation pathway is not itself a negative. It's how it's treated.
Right. And raspberry, I think the thread that runs through raspberries and strawberries is that they're both pretty bitter. And so maceration will help, can help spread that out a bit as well, because some of those bitter things extract better than others, and most of them don't distill very well. As we saw from the nose of Solaires last week.
And then just as to Dan, there are a couple of things if somebody wanted to experiment with what we have. We have a very, very limited amount of product coming from Mette and Reitzbauer, who would be more, again, they're not cheap, especially the Reitzbauer, but they're closer. Dan, if I'm right, doesn't Reitzbauer produces the way you were talking? Like they're not adding anything. They're doing more of a traditional distillation.
Right. And honestly, like the products that Jake, they're bringing in are like absolutely gorgeous. Some of the problems classically, this is sort of true to my heart, I have to mention. Some of the problems classically with German, certainly Geist and even Brandt products, where you have I won't put a value judgment on it, but there's a huge difference in the way distillates are taxed between the United States and Germany, for instance. In Germany, the distillates are taxed based on the wine gallons of wine or fruit, if you will, put into the still. In the United States, and this is a little esoteric, but actually I think we can untangle it and you can see the motivations here. In the United States, we're taxed on the amount of proof gallons or the volume of alcohol that comes out of the still. So no matter how much sugar we put into the wine here, if we were to run it through the still, we still pay tax on the amount of alcohol that comes out. In Germany, you only pay tax on the amount of wine that goes into the still. So you will see a lot of products that reflect the economic motivation of, how should we say this, getting the most alcohol out of the back end of the still with the least volume of wine on the front end of the still. And I will leave it to the reader to fill in the blank.
Come on, who doesn't love tales?
That's right.
I mean, a lot of those sorts of things, the nice thing in Teutonic law, and we're more familiar at House Alpens with Austrian law, the laws aren't that different between Austria and Germany. There is this designation Geist for spirits that aren't up to the requirements of Brand, but can still be tasty, although often they're overpriced and sold at duty-free stores. And then Schnapps, which you see on all, labels of things all over Teutonia is
Mhm.
essentially the same as the Japanese word sake. It just means booze, essentially.
But what
you
you're
know.
seeing, I'll bet dollars for dimes, what we're seeing in this picture is a particular type of what's typically called schnapps, is it not?
I don't know, actually.
It looks like beer schnapps. It looks like beer.
It could be beer schnapps.
I'm positive. There's nothing
Yeah,
else.
we have only Bernd does not enjoy having his picture taken, so we
Aha.
only have so many pictures of him with this still. Now, the classic idea of these is, if you go to a Gaststätte or a traditional restaurant,
Mhm.
at the end of the meal, there'll be 15 or 20 different little clear, tall, thin, clear bottles, much like with grappa in a traditional restaurant in Italy, of different Fruchtbrand from around to be drunk as a digestif neat. That said, one of the things that's been so much fun about working with products that are at the relatively reasonable price level of Perkart's fruit brandies, and then the liqueurs that he also makes, is that these distillates dilute so well. They're so fragrant when you dilute them, even cold and aerated and shaken in a cocktail. And we talked about last week, the classic idea of a aromatic clear spirit for mixing with an aromatized wine. Actually, we talked about this 3 weeks ago in the Americano Quinquina class. The classic idea that for cocktailing are agave spirits, which are beautifully aromatic, and they usually, if they're good, they dilute pretty well. But these fruit brandies mix in many of those same ways, and in particular in stirred cocktails, because they have relatively delicate aroma. They have some fresh aromas, as well as and so that's a big part of the fun of working with these, is that you can drink them neat. They're great to drink at room temperature. You don't have to put them in the freezer, and they show so well. They're very sort of archetypal fruit brandies, but they also dilute really, really well. And they are the base of really wonderful liqueurs, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, one category that we don't cover, but uses damson plums, which we go in the Avril damson gin, is Slivovitz, which is the sort of booze lingua franca of much of Eastern Europe. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit more about Slivovitz?
Well, Slivovitz is sort of if you move from west to east, from France to Eastern Europe, you'll encounter something in Alsace, which is one of my favorite things, called Quetch, eau de vie de Quetch, which is the classic prune, this classic prune. And then if you move
how's that spelled?
Oh God,
Quetsch, I believe.
Quetsch.
And then if you move a little further east, like even Germany, you'll get something called Svetchka. Svetchka is the same exact thing.
In fact, this guy makes a beautiful Svetchka brand.
I would imagine, gorgeous. And then when you get further east, you get Slivovitz. They're all essentially the same category. But as we've discussed, and there's really not a need to sort of break it down piece by piece, the laws governing the production in each country and each producer's own sort of moral standards will actually guide the quality that comes out. But they're all based on basically the same sensibilities about the same fruit. So
typically, how would a typical Balkan product be produced? Something coming from Serbia, Croatia, or Montenegro?
So there you kind of have me at a little bit disadvantage because I've never visited those distilleries directly. So the actual production methods, I don't know. I've tasted those distillates, and they typically are hotter and less concentrated, which to me is always indicative of some sort of dilution, right? Could be extra sugar, could be water, could be a number of different things. But as you move more towards this classic eau de vie d'Alsace, which I think the Mette is produced as eau de vie d'Alsace, they might have two. Then those are actually fermented. So they're fermented whole fruit with pits and distilled. So the pits versus no pits is a huge factor in the character of the distillate. As we said earlier, the pits always add this kind of almond, marzipan, benzaldehyde, hydrocyanide character. Love, And so the smaller the fruit, right, the smaller the diameter. So when Jake talked about the slow, we get Prunelle Sauvage in both France and in the Black Forest. So my German's not as good. And those are so small that the pit is a large volume of the fruit, and so you get this great almond character. Which when you're extracting, Jake explained, you really want to sort of moderate that effect. But it's used to great efficacy with eau de vie to produce these eau de vie that have this plum-like and sweet almond-like character. So I don't want to. We could go on about that one particular thing, this range of
now, one thing that I see in Slivovitz that I don't see in further west Damson brandies is aging, but the aged Slivovitzes are still very light in color. What can you tell us about that? And I mean, and often I find the extra aged ones have more of that pit character coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So and I would have failed to actually remember to talk about that. Even though they're white brandies, they're aged. And if you see like an eau de vie, reserve eau de vie from wherever, reserve, that's interesting. Why would you want to reserve, right? Once you distill it, it's done. Well, in fact, no. When it comes out of the still, we always say it has the flavor of the still. It's a little metallic, it's light, it's not integrated yet. So it needs to rest. And actuality, the longer the term of rest, the more concentrated, if you will. And it's not a loss of alcohol like you would have in a barrel, but in fact, it's a coming together of the flavor and aromatic compounds that make an intensity that's not there. So a common reserve eau de vie d'Alsace might be aged for 7, 8, and sometimes longer years in a neutral container, stainless steel or glass. So if you actually just quickly distill a product at whatever proof it down to whatever drinking strength you want, bottle it and sell it, you're always going to have a tight, non-expressive fruit distillate. Whereas if you would distill it, let it rest, and then however you deal with the alcohol content of the final product, hopefully gently. But that resting period, it should certainly be a minimum of a few months, preferably 6 months to a year, and then even longer in the case of very, very high quality eau de vie. So
this is also a consideration in rum agricole, in agave spirits.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, mezcal, incredibly important, and people sometimes don't understand if a mezcal producer does a really good job of putting on the label. And I remember going to Don Mateo and seeing what they do. I mean, they have stuff that they've been sitting on as long as 10 or 12 years, and for the intent of releasing it eventually rather than just having a catalog. Yeah. And it's all that, exactly what you talked about, that coming together, which they don't know scientifically, they know organoleptically, they know just by taste that it's better.
Well, that's basically all it is.
That's right.
There isn't a lot of science of it, but I think that the easy way to explain it to the folks out there is, you've all seen stills. The stills are not gentle apparatus, and the idea that something delicate and intricate can come off of a still is going to require a bit of time afterwards just to sort itself out. So, all right. So we have two fruit brands, Fruchtbrand, Fruchtbrande, if you will, that we do with Bernd Perkart, and probably the two most important fruits for distillation in Austria. The first is what we call Bartlett Pears, Pyrrhus communis, which are called Williams pears in most of the world. As you know, if you've ever eaten a Bartlett pear from hand, it's got a beautiful, sweet, floral aroma. But like any stone fruit, the concentration of flavor is really not there. And so at the distillation step, which in the case of pears will select a lot of those fruity and floral aromas, but also concentrate those aromas such that you really do get that sense much more so than eating from hand or drinking the juice of the essence of the pear. This is one that is very easy to love. It is, it's very fragrant. If you like pisco, you're going to love this. Mm-hmm. And you can use it in a lot of those same ways. But I also find that there's an intricacy and a delicacy and a dilutability to this that is really fun in stirred drinks. Much like you heard the first 2 sessions of this, you heard my love of stirred drinks with agave spirits. Much the same here. That you get so much nose in a finished cocktail that it really draws you in. But it's also fruity enough that even if you're having a bit of a gathering, splash it into a fruit salad. It's a great deal of fun. I know we don't do a lot about cocktail recipes here, but I did want to share one. This is a drink from unfortunately a restaurant that's no longer there in Easton, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. But this is a drink that I think shows everything about both naming cocktails, but also about how Picard Pear Williams really shines. It's just a 50-50 martini. You can use a dry vermouth, you can use an off-dry vermouth, but it's one of those things. The texture of this drink is beautiful. The orange bitters do what they do and provide some mid-palate firmness. But it's a drink that you could certainly glug in a glass on the rocks and it'll dilute and it will still be fine.
And Pear William or Poir William or is really, I think, the first eau de vie that if you've never tried eau de vie, you want to try this one. It's hard to imagine that if somebody tasted the Picard Pear Williams that you wouldn't immediately fall in love with these. The beautiful thing about eau de vie, and I think you sort of, well, you talked about it for a second. You said if you were to go to a restaurant, classical restaurant, you'd be offered sort of whatever, 20, 30 different eau de vies, right? The really kind of interesting, cool thing is they're all perfectly clear. Like if you were to line them up on the tabletop, one by one by one, there's no possible chance you could tell the difference between any of them. And yet, if you put your nose in those glasses, they just explode with the flavor of fruit from one or another types of fruit. And Poir William is the one which really, I think, is the sexiest and the most sort of the one that'll draw you into really loving eau de vie for the rest of your career.
Can we? I think this is a good place to talk about glassware then. Pat, did I see you using a tulip to taste that?
I am.
You want to talk a little bit about?
Not quite a tulip.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Well,
I think all of us mostly drink these things from sort of whatever we use to taste spirits. Dan and Pat both holding up a very fun.
This is what we always use to taste spirits in the office here. This is a Copita, very similar to Dan's there. We get these from Glencairn. We have them around in a fair bit of our stores. It's what you'll use, whenever, when we can have in-person events again, if Brett or I are leading a seminar or if a guest is leading a seminar, this is the glassware we put out for it. I like it because it keeps the surface area relatively small so it doesn't blow off a lot of its nose and it kind of concentrates it upwards. It has that kind of chimney-like effect to it. And
the other thing is that the surface area is low. So when you're drinking spirits neat and you have a glass which has a large surface area, you're going to tend to evaporate a large volume of alcohol quickly, and so it'll tend to dilute the aroma of the spirit in the nose. Whereas if you keep the surface area low in the glass and concentrate the aroma, you'll get more of the fruit character. The other thing, well, for me at least, is to taste everything here in the distillery in a standard glass. So we just have, at home we have beautiful glasses for serving cocktails, but here in the distillery, if we want to taste something, we taste it in a standard glass first.
Brett, do you want to talk about the glass you're using?
This is something that I think, and Dan, you correct if you can see it. This would be more. It's a typical Armagnac glass, I believe.
Where is
this
it?
is something that I got from.
Hold it. You're not holding it up. We can't see it.
Hold it in front of your face.
Yeah.
How's that?
Yeah.
There we go.
Same.
Yeah, this is something I got from my friend Jerome Delord at Delord in Armagnac. But this is, again, following it's going to stick with some of the same principles you talked about. What Pat talked about, obviously, it's narrow at the top, it's tapered, which means it'll concentrate the aroma, and there is a lot more surface area exposed at the top than there is glass exposure.
That's the important point, right? That the surface area has liquid on it, not like a liquid that's evaporating, right? So that glass is keeping the liquid in the bottom and not exposing a lot of the glass surface to evaporating alcohol, and then it's concentrating what's evaporating off the liquid in the bottom of the glass.
I also find that glasses like that sort of force you to take smaller sips. And if any of you are into tea at all, if you play around with very fine teas and you do very short extractions over and over and over again, you'll unfold layer upon layer upon layer out of one little pile of tea leaves. And it's the same thing when you sip a fine eau de vie. It's you like we talked about last week, often what you taste is what's left after the rest of your palate is overloaded. And if you taste something very slowly, you're going to feel and sense different characteristics of it over time.
And that's actually a true physical phenomena as well. So, the kids were home from college and we were going through some aromatic samples, and I pulled some citrus samples, some petitgrain, some bergamot, some cedrat samples. And if you smell those taster strips as a function of time, they change. They actually change. So what's the first couple of minutes versus 15 versus an hour versus 10 hours versus a day is very, very different. And the reason is because what's actually coming off the liquid is changing, right? So the technical thing is a chromatographic column, but it's real. It's not just that you're sensing something different. It's actually that there's really different compounds coming off as a function of time.
Yeah. And this is the same especially in malt Scotch. It's just, the with the lack of wood here, you get a little bit more the textural elements that you get when you, in addition to the aromatic elements you get, are things you don't have to worry about ascribing to wood versus ascribing to the spirit. So. All right, and the other brand that we are able to get in enough quantity to sell from Purcard is, of course, Marilla or apricots from Klosterneuburg, the most famous place in the world for apricots in the Wachau part of Austria. Now here, the fermentation is done with the pits, with the stones of the apricots, and so you are going to get a fair amount of non-fruit aromatics that get selected and concentrated by the distillation. For me, they fill into kind of three areas that you don't get the almond. I don't get a ton of almond off of this sort of thing. I get spice, I get earth, and I get licorice. And these are all things that if you taste this right after the Pear Williams, this will come across as much less fruity, even though the finish will have that great concentration of apricot flavor. What those characteristics also do is provide a ton of complexity in long cocktails. This is a great one to make even a highball with, and really explore what dilution does to this. But I think a really festive way to drink it is in a French 75 riff. So this is one from when Chad Solomon worked at the Plaza Hotel many years ago. Just a very simple French 75. He uses honey as the sweetener. In terms of aromatized wines, I think because of the extra sort of firmness you get from those seed elements, I would use something like Cocchi Americano Bianco, something a little bit sweeter to mix with Blue Marillion compared to what I would mix with the Pear Williams. But they work very well in very simple ways still. Anybody want to reflect on challenges for distilling apricots or challenges to getting people to understand how apricot distillate should taste?
Apricots are so you moved from prunus, which we started with plums. Apricots are still in the genus Prunus, and then we talked about Poire William, which is a pomme fruit, totally different type of fruit, and then back to apricots, so back to Prunus, right? Apricots are if you contrast them with respect to peach, although peach is a very, very difficult distillate to get to show. Even a great ripe peach, for some reason, when it's distilled, when it's macerated distilled or fermented distilled, whichever you like, it doesn't really show as well. Apricots is really the greatest of the great of those. I don't know. They're almost on the citrus side of prunus, right? They have this beautiful aromaticity to them. So and
beautiful fuzzy skins.
And beautiful fuzzy skin, yeah. And the season is super short. And remember, everything that Jake's been talking about, it's not the fact that they can actually offer these bring them into the United States and offer them at the prices that they're being offered at is amazing to me as a producer, because, you know, I don't mean to degrade or any kind of grain based product, but grains can be stored. So we can harvest them once a year and we can store them and then actually make the distillate throughout the year, however we care. Apricots, all fruit needs to be harvested, fermented or macerated at one time and then distilled. But the season for apricots is so short. It's one of the reasons we don't see them in the stores. It's one of the reasons why they're not commercially successful, which has nothing to do with the quality of the fruit, only the sort of marketability of that very short season and the difficulty in getting an apricot that both tastes really well and transports from producer to market. So eau de vie is one of the great ways, I think, that you can actually really experience really well ripened, beautiful summer apricots.
I bought some in 2019. I bought some Klosterneuburg apricots at a market, not in Klosterneuburg, but in Germany, in fact. And 2 days later, they were mush, but they were really good for those 2 days. But if you think about an apricot you buy in the grocery store, it has almost no flavor. Even a dried apricot doesn't have a ton of flavor. And this is where distillation and concentration is absolutely essential if you want to get anything that's going to be expressive on the palate, especially diluted in a cocktail. And now we move into the last topic, the last overall topic for tonight, which is fruit liqueurs. Guys, fruit liqueurs are all over the map. There's some very, very brightly colored and brightly and brashly flavored things. There are things made from beautiful fruit, but with neutral alcohol as the base, which creates this sensation of eating from hand. There are certainly a wonderful tradition of cognac-based fruit liqueurs, Belle de Brie being one example that's pear. What there isn't a ton of are fruit liqueurs where the base is distilled from the fruit. And so the products we're going to talk about tonight from Rothman and Winter, also made at Perkart, are pretty special, especially where they are on the price spectrum, in terms of they are not flavors of a line. They're not neutral alcohol plus a syrup. They are built from the ground up to taste, to express that fruit as best as Bernd Perkart can. And so it's important when you taste and evaluate fruit liqueurs, whether you know they're artificially flavored or flavored with natural flavors, whether or not you know if they're a neutral base or a flavorful base or a fruit brandy base, dilute. If you're going to put these things in a cocktail, taste them as if you were going to put them in a cocktail. We tell people to dilute fruit liqueurs 5x with water to taste them, because that's how they're going to be used in a drink. You know, everything tastes good neat, but it's what you get out in dilution that really unlocks whether something is mainly based on a syrup versus something that's based on the totality of the fruit. And the other thing, and to me, the principal characteristic of good mixability for a fruit liqueur is nose, not flavor. What do you smell in the finished cocktail? Because the other things, if you're making say a gin sour, right? You're going to taste, hopefully you're going to taste a lot of gin in that drink. But it's what you smell that is the real drawing in of that fruit, just like it is when you eat a fruit, right? If it doesn't smell like anything, it's not going to matter how good it tastes or how sweet it is. And so 4 fruit liqueurs in this family, vom Still und Saft, so from still and the juice. These are made the same way. The fruit brand, like we talked about, spirit without any chaptalization or added alcohol. The fruit juice, and then sugar and water to get them to the right proof and the right strength. But in general, a bit drier, or a bit to quite a bit drier than what else is in their world. But you get the natural acidity, the natural bitterness, the natural texture of the fruit, and then you get that whack of the brandy that means that when you use it in something, it still shines through. All of these things are good in sparkling wine. They're all good in wheat beers. They're all good in cook. They're great for cooking. They're great for making glazes or syrups or pumping up the fruitiness, even in like a red wine stew with the orchard cherry or even the peach. These are things, we don't refer to these things as flavors because they are built from the ground up, but they do exactly what's said on the tin, what it says on the bottle. They are, you want cherry? These are cherry. Prunus eminence Beck is the Vaccinatilis variety of cherries. They are semi-sour, so not quite as sour as our good old mid-Atlantic pie cherries, but or Michigan super tart cherries, but still quite bright, and there's great acidity in that. The peaches, there's a few varieties of peaches, the Haven, there's even some Pêche de Vigne or Weinberg peaches. And then the apricots and the pears, the base of these is the exact same brandy that is put in the eau de vie. So all really useful products, all very good price. And but when you taste the field, I think of fruit liqueurs out there, I think you see in these a particular intensity and brightness.
Yeah, for our purposes, we see a decent amount of peach move in the summer because of bourbon and iced tea, and it makes it. I mean, that's a sort of ubiquitous thing that you see across the board. But all year round, I think of these four, apricot is the one that kind of moves the most.
Yeah, apricot is the one that classic cocktail books call for the most by far, and I don't know the reason for that. I don't know if there's anybody out there that has all the cocktail history that can say why apricot flavored brandy became so much more of a cocktail thing than other fruits. But we definitely see more apricot move just because of what people see in cocktail books. The cherry is my personal favorite, again, because of its acidity. And then you get a little bit of that prunelle kind of almondy note on the nose from the distillate. I love to put the cherry in a glass of Guinness, a dry stout. The peach is great in wheat beers, but also in bourbon. But they're just so different from what else is out there, and the pricing is very, very good, especially at Binny's. So.
And
and they're far more natural tasting than a lot of the other ones that are out there
right.
too.
So both more natural and more concentrated, and that's we wouldn't do them if they weren't. There's no point in doing overly sweet, underly flavored fruit liqueurs. That market is well served.
Mm-hmm.
They might actually do better in summer, but I would argue if in winter you need to sort of remember that summer's coming. These are the kinds of things which really, the minute you put them in the glass, they just bring summer forward. They're basically like summertime in a glass.
Yeah, I mean, Jake's mentioned fruit in hand several times now, and it's just like these are just fresh, juicy fruit with a little spike of added sugar, but not too much, not a distracting amount. What I would say,
especially in dilution. And what I find is if something that is neutral alcohol based will feel much more sugary when you dilute it. Like it'll be, most of them are higher sugar anyway, because the only thing that's bringing flavor is the flavoring syrup. But then when you dilute them, that sensation of the sugar and the lack of nose will make them feel much sweeter than maybe they are at that point in dilution. All of this is of a piece that we will come back to again and again and again, which is how to taste these things. Mm-hmm. I hope that over the last these four sessions, you've gotten a bit of inspiration in terms of how to taste things that may seem relatively routine on the shelf. The sessions to come will continue to talk about how to taste these things. So hope and if you have questions, I try to go back into the comments and answer questions as well. So even if you're watching this at a later date, I'll try to go back in and check questions. And if not, you can always hit me up on Facebook under my name. So my Facebook profile picture is a concrete egg fermenter. That's how you can differentiate me from all the other Jake Parrots out there. And before we go, a little bit more information. Of course, Binny's, Pat and Brett and his crew do a great job writing up cocktails and usage ideas. And then our website, which I will take a brief minute to show again. This is our website. The front page at alpens.com. You can look at products via wine or spirits. So here, let's just say fruit liqueurs. This is the sort of capsule view of things. We'll go to Rothman Cherry. Storage information, description of the producer, description of the category, and then a few recipes here. Rothman Cherry and espresso is really tasty. Some setup information for our retailer friends, and then if you click here, it'll plumb into our retail database and or our recipe database, and you'll get all the recipes that are using Rothman Cherry. If you want to look at recipes more generally, this is the full page, full set of recipes up to 535. So a few more, 35 more from last week. And then you can filter by product right here. So let's say Rothman Apricot, and here are 21 cocktails that use Rothman Apricot. Some of them are complicated. We do like to put our friends' cocktails up there when we can, but there's some really beautiful, simple drinks as well. So.
Cool. Thank you, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So we've covered quite a range of liqueurs here. We've done herbal, we've done bitter, we've done floral, we've done fruit. We've done wine-based, we've done spirit-based now too. What started as a Vermouth 101 now has ballooned into this. And we were talking, I know Brett's intention at the beginning of this, I think, was to just figure out a way where we could eventually do a virtual tasting and talk about Carcavelos and Madeira, which I think we're going to do next Monday then, right? And that's a couple interesting fortified wines that you also have the pleasure to work with and that are unique in that world. I mean, everybody has heard of sherry and port, but Carcavelos is something that still surprises, I think, even a lot of seasoned people in the wine world, right?
So a botanical free zone next week.
Botanical free.
But we will talk about acidity. We'll talk about what it means for a wine to age. And we'll talk about some really beautiful places in the world too.
Yeah.
Well, and and Dan is, we will have Dan as a winemaker involved, and I'm also going to invite, if the time works for him, a close friend of ours, part of the year Benny's employee, the other part of the year has a wine label called Chasing Harvest, where he produces still wines in the Douro Valley in the fall, and Riesling, Pinot Noir, and now Sauvignon Blanc in Central Otago in New Zealand, which is where he is currently, Michael Cush. And we're going to invite Michael to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the, while he's only making still wine in the Douro Valley in Portugal, he has some background in making fortified wines in Portugal. And so we'll see what Mike has to say about that as well.
Should be pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then, but not to fear, the spirits-based discussion will continue. We were talking before we went live here today about getting a broader gin-based discussion on the books, specifically how to approach tasting gin and the different styles of gin out there. There are so many different styles of gin out there now, and it's not all just juniper heavy.
It's going to shock you.
Heavy. Yeah.
It's going to shock you. Cool. Juniper doesn't taste like pine.
So keep an eye on the virtual events page, and that'll be up there soon. We're launching a new website tomorrow, so hopefully nothing gets lost. We'll see how that goes. So guys, thanks again for joining. Jake, thank you. Dan, thank you. Colby, nice to have you. Thanks for joining us today. Everybody else, thank you for joining us and watching tonight. If you got any questions, obviously information's there. You can also email spirits@bennies.com. That goes right to Brett and I. We can take care of any questions on that. And we'll be back next Monday to talk about off the beaten path fortified wines. So
awesome.
all right, see you guys then. Cheers, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Bye.